What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Thomas, bringing you another edition of the Thomas Take. And everybody knew what I was going to be talking about today. I had a lot planned for this show yesterday, a lot of different topics that I wanted to talk about, but some late breaking news last night, as reported by MMA Junkie, that Dana White did an interview with an Australian media news source, and he stated that the fight pitting middleweight champion, current UFC middleweight champion, Michael Bisping versus the former welterweight champion, George St.Pierre, is off. And now Bisping will take on Yoel Romero, most likely on the July card in Anaheim. Probably is the co-main event to John Jones and Daniel Cormier's rematch. Now, Dana White didn't say that, but I will get to why I believe that could be the case very shortly. But let me just start off by saying this act by Dana White as the UFC president is a complete and utter joke. This now ranks as the number one moment for me as the worst moment, the worst decision that the UFC has made in terms of matchmaking since the decision not to give Alexander Gustafsson a rematch versus John Jones, a fight that was very close, a fight that I thought, you asked 10 people, 5 or 6 might have said Gustafsson won, and they put John Jones in a fight with Glover Teixeira. That was mind-blowing. This is mind-blowing. This right here is mind-blowing. When George St.Pierre retired from the sport back in 2013, he had been a champion of the UFC welterweight division for over 6 years, defending his belt on average 2 to 3 times a year. One of the most active UFC champions of all time. Probably the most active UFC champion of all time. He walks away from the sport coming off a split decision victory over Johnny Hendricks. GSP was bogged down. He had come back from several ACL injuries, one of which took over a year away from his career and forced the UFC to put together a interim welterweight title fight featuring Carlos Condit and Nick Diaz. Do you remember that? I sure do. GSP fought both of those fighters, beat them both very dominantly, and then fought Johnny Hendricks to a split decision victory and walked off into the sunset. But the question always remained over the heads of the diehard UFC fans like myself, when would GSP return? So back in February, when the UFC announced that Michael Bisping would be defending his middleweight title against George St.Pierre, the intrigue was there. You had the top draw from England in Bisping, the first and only British champion in MMA history. And then you had the Canadian juggernaut that was and is George St.Pierre in terms of his marketing appeal to the Canadian audience. Fast forward to May, and GSP puts out a video that states he will be ready to take on Michael Bisping sometime after October, possibly November. So GSP, on GSP's account, he needs more time to bulk up, going from welterweight 170 pounds to middleweight 185 pounds. Keep in mind that GSP had been fighting at welterweight his entire career, and he was not always the bigger welterweight in his title fights. So moving up a weight class meant that GSP would be even smaller than he was on average as a welterweight, being the smallest middleweight that is probably in that division currently, in the middleweight division currently. So he decides to move up. There's intrigue there. The UFC makes the fight. Then there's this large uproar over this fight for God knows why. Yoel Romero is the number one contender. Yoel Romero, in my eyes, deserves nothing. He knocked out Chris Weidman in the 3rd round. He's on a winning streak. He's won some fights, but he did not beat Luke Rockhold. He barely got by Jacare Souza. And it's safe to say Chris Weidman is not what he once was. I'm going to look at Yoel Romero's record right now. Did Yoel Romero fight Gegard Mousasi? I don't think he did. I'm going to look that up right now. Yoel Romero, did he fight Jacare Souza? Did he fight Jacare Souza? Barely got off the stool, literally, against Tim Kennedy. 13 wins, 1 loss. Never fought Jacare. He's got wins over Brunson, Tavares, Tim Kennedy, who, that was the stool gate. Defeated Lyoto Machida. Lyoto fought that fight on 2 weeks' notice. A split decision over Jacare and a win over Chris Weidman. His most impressive win is over Chris Weidman. He barely got through the Jacare Souza fight. So to say that Yoel deserves the fight versus Michael Bisping is a little insane to me. But that's another point I want to make a little bit later. But if the UFC thought that this was not the right fight to make, why did they make it? Why was this fight even made in the first place if they were just going to cancel it for the same reason in which they already knew going in to the negotiation table? They knew that GSP could not fight until September, October, or November, being that he's moving up a weight class, being that he has a packed schedule for other media obligations. This is a very popular figure that we're talking about. Guy that does movies, guy that's been in several movies. He has a booked schedule for this summer. The understanding was not July, as Dana White said, it was not in July. The understanding was that they were going to fight. And Michael Bisping himself said on his Believe You Me podcast that he would not be able to fight anyway until October or November because of his knee injury. He went under the knife, he had knee surgery, and his knee has not reacted the way he thought it would, which leads me to believe he will not be ready till October or November anyway. So this was just a classic case of the UFC showing that they did not care about this fight. They do not want to wait around for George St.Pierre. They do not want to make this fight. This is the number one disappointment in my eyes in quite some time. And if anybody needed more proof that the UFC does not care about GSP, I don't know what you need now at this point, because they do not. The UFC could put Conor McGregor in a title fight after he went 1-1 in his last 2 fights, losing to a guy who wasn't even ranked in the top 10 on a week's notice, but they can't wait for GSP and Bisping. The company is turning into a joke. Yoel Romero is going to destroy Michael Bisping and send him into retirement. This fight on both ends of the spectrum puts a huge kibosh on everything in terms of GSP fighting as a middleweight contender, a middleweight title challenger, not allowing him the opportunity to win 2 belts in 2 different weight classes. And then you look at it on the other side of the coin, Michael Bisping getting robbed of the biggest payday of his career when this is a fighter that has main evented more UFC events than anyone in the history of the company. Why would they rob Michael Bisping of this opportunity to make the big money in a bout versus GSP? That's what this was about. Bisping won the title, took the title shot on 2 weeks' notice, 17 days' notice versus Luke Rockhold. He knocked him out in the first round. He takes on Dan Henderson. He gets the opportunity to avenge that loss while Luke Rockhold sits at home and cries, while Yoel Romero gets past Chris Weidman, while Jacare Souza takes fights versus Robert Whittaker and loses. There was no reason at all, none, to not make this fight. They didn't want to promote it. They didn't care to promote it. If they did, they would have done it. This fight could have easily happened in September or October, easy, for both fighters. And they could have given this fight the proper promotion that it needs. You have enough fights in the summer to hold weight. You have Garbrandt versus Dillashaw. You have Jones versus Cormier 2. You had enough fights. You got great fights coming up on this card with Stipe and Junior Dos Santos. You have great fights coming up. This could have been the opener to the fall schedule. September, October, November, whatever it may be. This fight could have easily happened, and the fact that it didn't is a disgrace. And I had heard around, let's just say 8 o'clock, actually 6 o'clock, that the UFC wants to pull the plug on Bisping versus GSP. Michael Bisping does not want them to do so. But guess what? Around 10:30, they did it anyway. So, this is the day and age that we live in as a UFC fan. No one gets what they want except for Dana White and Conor McGregor. Dana caters to Conor. Conor caters to him. Dana does not put on the fights that people want to see within anybody else, but allowing Conor to have the right to negotiate a deal with a boxer while Conor has never defended a belt in his UFC career. And we're talking about taking away an opportunity from arguably, in my eyes at least, but arguably the greatest UFC champion that the company has ever had. You do not sell for $4.2 billion without the guys that built the notoriety of the brand UFC. One of those guys was George St.Pierre. And now you take away this opportunity. Now what? Now what does this mean for George St.Pierre? Who does he fight? Does he go back down to welterweight and get his belt back? What is the next option for George St.Pierre? Anderson Silva? That's an option that first popped into my head. But let's be honest. Anderson Silva is nowhere near where he once was. Even 2-3 years ago, he has declined in terms of his athletic prowess and his movement and his agility inside the octagon. He's nowhere near what he once was. I would say that Anderson should retire, and more so, the only fight that Anderson has looked as if he is winning the last 5 years is his bout versus retirement. He's fighting against retirement. He will not retire. And you have Anderson stating that he wants to fight Yoel for an interim belt. That whole conversation started this cluster catastrophe of an issue within the UFC. Of Yoel not getting his title shot. We're talking about a fighter that crapped himself during a UFC fight, getting a middleweight title shot over a 6-time, 9-time defending UFC champion. Demetrius Johnson passed him, tied Anderson Silva's record of 10, GSP's at 9. Unbelievable. I was so looking forward to this fight, and for all the people that said that they were not looking forward to this fight and they would have rather seen Yoel Romero, wow, that's the day and age that we live in of the UFC. That just shows that there are so many uninformed, casual fans to this sport that did not understand. You have the pride of England versus the pride of Canada going up against each other, most likely in Canada later in the year in Edmonton or the Rogers Centre or wherever they decide to do it. I'm flabbergasted, appalled, and just disgusted that the UFC decided to scrap this fight. This was the one fight I was looking forward to more than any other fight in this 2017 year. I like Michael Bisping. I like GSP. GSP is the reason why I started watching this sport. Thank you, Dana White. Thank you for giving us the ultimate tease. Take care.